Hello, welcome to our webinar on how to organize a summit. I'm here with Robertha Barnes, who is a snapper and an amazing organizer. And she's going to walk us through how she organized the Health Justice Conference at Upstate. And Robertha, I would just love to hear a little bit about you for our audience and talk us through how you got into the Medicare for All movement.
Sure. I'll introduce myself. My name is Robertha Barnes. I'm MS1 at SUNY Upstate. And I guess I got started with the Medicare for All movement kind of passively, I guess. I started out just wanting to get more involved in social justice work and advocacy. At the time, I was a post-bac student in Kansas City, Missouri, and I went to a talk on race that my church was holding. And the organizer of that meeting was really impressed with what I was saying, so she invited me to join the Kansas City chapter of More Squared, and they do social justice and racial justice work in the city, in Kansas City, Missouri. So I got started, I became a board member for that organization. And then it became time for us to decide on what we wanted to focus on specifically. And I was like, well, I'm a pre-health, pre-med student, so I guess I'll focus on health policy issues. And that's kind of how I got started with the Medicare for All movement, because in Kansas City, Missouri, we were working on expanding Medicaid, Obamacare in that state. So then that kind of just blossomed, like after I started a master's program in Cleveland, and then I continued doing advocacy work there. And then when I came to Upstate as a master's student, I joined SNAP. And so I continued, and it just kind of like continued to grow. And I think also my passion for Medicare for All also comes from my personal stories and personal experiences of going through a period of time in my life where I didn't have healthcare, and I really needed a root canal, and I couldn't afford it. But luckily, my mom was able to apply for both of us to get Medicaid. It was newly expanded in New York State under Obamacare at that time. So because of that, I was able to get it covered, but otherwise I wouldn't have. And I was just like, oh my God, like imagine if this hadn't come through at this time, if this law wasn't passed. I have a personal experience where I've seen how a legislative action can affect someone's life. So I think that's why it keeps me involved and passionate.
So it's the personal and professional that brought you to this place where you want to work in Medicare for All.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I know that you've dedicated a lot of your time to that, whether you were on the SNAP board for Students for National Health Program, or organizing summits, or attending rallies. But today we're going to talk specifically about the Health Justice at Upstate Summit, because that has really blossomed. It started in 2018, is that correct?
Yep, by a graduating student named Cindy Russell Lead.
Awesome. And kind of what sparked the idea to start that summit, and if you could give us some background on kind of what's involved.
I don't know where she got the idea of having a conference, but and there was just a lot of people on board. I think the first year there was something like 12 co-chairs, which we now know is way too many people. But yeah, what was the second part of the question?
Yeah, what's the conference look like? So what is it about? What kind of programming do you look to fill?
Yeah, so I think the overall goal of the Health Justice Conference is to highlight health disparities to bring them to attention. Um, and then like allowing a way for pre-health students to get involved. So a part of health justice is making sure that um, there are more minorities in the health professions. So we also worked on that, and we extended the invitation to pre-med students. Um, and then like also continuing education for doctors. So doctors are also invited. In a couple years, we try to work on I think it's called the LCME credit or something like that. That hasn't gone through yet, but that's something we're working on. So yeah, just people from all the way down to high school students to doctors being educated about health disparities, increasing the amount of minorities in medicine, um, highlighting advocacy. That was something I was passionate about as a chair. Um, yeah.
And how was that first received in 2018 when that kind of got started? Were students really interested, or was it hard to get buy-in?
I think it was well received by students. I think it was more well received. I think we're year after year we're surprised by how many faculty and doctors are interested in the event and want to attend. Um, I know I guess students are busy, so none of my students are busy, and sometimes the schedule doesn't work out. But yeah, I think it's pretty decent student turnout and student interest. But we really get a lot of support from the community. A lot of communities want to get involved. A lot of doctors are always happy to present every year. Um, Faculty are really supportive. Yeah.
That's good. Feels like everyone's getting involved here, which is always helpful.
Yeah.
I know organizing myself, getting that buy-in is probably one of the hardest parts, getting people to want to do things. And speaking of doing things, we're going to move on to the nitty gritty of organizing a conference, which is the logistics, which I'm sure thinking about it kind of haunts you, as it haunts all of us as who formed the conference. But I think it's really important to run through this because I know before this session, you and I kind of discussed how it's easy to create a one pager for an organizer and say, this is the checklist of what you need to organize a summit. And until you've done it,
Yep.
it's really different. So what goes through your mind at the beginning of getting this conference together? What are you thinking about? What are you making sure you have off the bat?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that we worked on as there were two other co-chairs, the first thing we worked on was getting a good speaker list, right? Because people go to conferences because they see someone that they're interested attending, someone they're interested in is attending or speaking. So we knew that's a big pull, and so we wanted to make sure that we got speakers who were um, highly regarded, not just at Upstate, but um, across the nation, especially in this past year. It's a virtual conference, and I was just astounded at who they were able to pull. I don't know where they got these people from. So I think that's the first thing, and that is not easy at all. I think I was talking to another friend who's interested in being a chair, and I said that for every one speaker that you have at a conference, there's probably 5 people that you had to go through. Um, you're calling them every day. You're only getting voicemail. I remember sneaking out of sneaking out of class during a little 10-minute break between lectures to try to call someone's office. Um, yeah, it's not easy. But also with speakers, you want to make sure. So, like a highly esteemed person with a nice resume doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good speaker. So something else we did as chairs was going through YouTube and trying to see if we could find events where these speakers spoke before, so we can get an idea of what they would sound like, especially for our chair, or not the chair, for the keynote speaker event. I think that was really important. We made sure we had someone who's a good speaker. So I think that was yeah, the chair, I'd say the keynote speaker was probably the most difficult seat to fill because that person really needs to be well-rounded. Everyone's going to be listening to them. So they need to not only be a highly esteemed, regarded person, but they need to be a good speaker. They need to be able to take questions. Personable. We don't want to work with anyone who's behind too many cages. Like I have to speak to their secretary and I can't actually talk to them kind of people. Um, yeah. I won't
Do
rant
you
on for too long.
do you remember of any circumstances where you wanted a speaker to come and the cost of speaking was astronomical? You know, you had a speaker that wanted a couple $1,000s.
All the time. Yeah, that's very common. Very common.
How do you handle that?
I think I think the first thing we did was try to go back to the school and ask if we could increase our budgets so we could have a speaker. And then the school said that this is the amount that we give for speakers, and that's standard. We don't give any more than that. So we had to go back to the speakers and be like, well, we're confined by these policies. We offer you any more than that. We still really like to have you. And sometimes they decline, but sometimes we got lucky. Yeah, so that's how we about that.
And so you're thinking about your speakers. What about the space, the organizing space? Do you have certain classrooms that you're allowed to use? Or I know some chapters, when they're hosting conferences, they have community centers or gyms, or they do it at someone's house. But I think for you all, you use classrooms. Is that correct?
Yep, we use classrooms. We use the academic building. Actually, we were able to have access to the whole building, so that was really nice. The top floor is large and can hold over 200 people. I'm not exactly sure what the capacity is, but it could hold enough for a pretty large conference. And has big windows. It's really a beautiful room. You can see all of Syracuse. And then like on the floors below, that's where we held the conference. And so it's really, yeah, it's a really nice setup. Um,
So that probably dictates how many people you can invite then, right? Or did you
yeah,
have so much space that that wasn't a factor?
no, that was definitely a factor. I think we were kind of running towards capacity. I think we had about 300 people register and we were edging towards capacity. And so we actually had to cut off um, registration. But then things got messy because people said they couldn't go, and then we had to reopen it. It was kind of it was kind of a mess. But I think the real limiting factor was the food. That was really the limiting factor because we have a budget and we can't feed. We want to feed 500 people, but we can't with our budget. So um, that was the real limiting factor.
Yeah. Oh, I imagine. And you know, when we talk about inclusivity at a conference, we're not just talking about the physical space. You know, is it wheelchair accessible? Are there elevators? Can you walk up to the front door easily? But with food, it's also a conversation about making it inclusive for everybody. So, was that something that was difficult for you all to figure out? Caterers that had gluten-free and halal and vegetarian and vegan and all the options to make sure people felt comfortable and well fed.
Yep, that was definitely a factor as well, making sure that everyone could eat um, vegan, vegetarian. I think those were our main accommodations. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many things to think about. Um,
Yeah.
what did that ever get overwhelming for you? Just all of the logistics.
Yes. I think inevitably every year there always seems to be a tension between the chairs of the conference. And looking back now, it's like, oh, that's such a minuscule thing to be arguing with somebody over. But at the time of the conference, it just everything means a lot to you because I think each chair has their own vision of how this event is going to perfect. And so someone else's vision of how this event is going to be perfect is different from yours. So they can align, and then that creates a little bit of tension and conflict. I'm pretty sure that's happened every year, so I think it's just inevitable. I don't know. We've talked about ways to make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
What
But
are some of those ways, that you all brainstorm to make it go a little smoother interpersonally?
Yeah, we have we haven't done much besides saying we need to do something. We need to do something about this. I think the main thing we thought of was like making sure that um, the current chairs had enough support from the past chairs and
Mm,
speaking to them and letting them know that having disagreements is not uncommon, but just working through it and realizing that at the end of the day, you all have the same goal. You're all working towards a great thing. So to not get upset if you don't agree with someone over something like having a coat check or whether how many portions of the vegan option should we have, like those kinds of things are not important because you're all serving a bigger purpose and have a bigger goal.
right. It's kind of that iceberg of emotions, right? So you have somebody's reaction at the top of the iceberg or kind of how they're being perceived. And then underneath, it's everything on top of it. And I know for the Medicare for All movement, if we're getting antsy about the coat check, when we really go below the iceberg, it's thinking about folks that are so committed and so emotional about this movement because we're
Mhm.
seeing people dying, that it's really those
Yeah.
feelings manifesting. Um, well, I want to hear a little bit about social media because I know some members are just learning about Facebook, and we have some members that have like 3 Facebook accounts. So I'm going to share a screen because I think it's really important to go through all of the amazing resources you guys have for your conference. So I'm going to share the screen. And this is our Zoom. And we're going to go first to your webpage on your school site. Now, do you have to contact your school to get this up, or did they do it automatically for you?
We had to contact the school to get it up. I believe there were some issues this past year with getting the school to update the website. So this past year's team made their own website. Um,
Yeah. Well, it's really comprehensive. I mean, you have the schedule, you have your speakers. Did you all have to provide all the text for this?
yes, we did. Yeah.
Okay. That's a lot. Did you have one
Yeah.
person in charge of that, or?
We all worked on it together. Like we all worked on the schedule, so we were able to submit that. And then our speakers, we all each divided up the speakers that we were each in contact with. I think we separated it, so we were able to gather together and give them the information for that. Um, yeah,
For that?
and
And yeah, but on top of this page, you have this email here, which I think is really nice for a conference to not give out people's personal emails, but to have a conference email so that it's not all falling on one person. That's really smart.
mhm.
But you also have a web page, and this is the correct web page.
Yep, yes,
So I love this because at the top here, you have the date of the conference, you have the title of the conference, and you have how folks can RSVP. Can you explain why it's really important to have all this at the top of the page for people?
yeah. I think too often you're trying to find information for something and you just want like what time is it, what how do I register, and those things should be front and center so that people can easily access it. It shouldn't be at somewhere at the end of the page and you have to keep scrolling. um, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you cover everything. You make sure to remind people to check their spam box. Can you talk to me a little bit about the land acknowledgement? I know we've been to several conferences where we acknowledge the land we're on. Can you tell me more about kind of what this means and why it's important to address it for conferences?
Yeah. So that was something, again, that this past year's team had done. But I think it's very important for all conferences to do that because it's recognizing that um, the land we are on, that we're using to hold out this event was stolen. It's giving acknowledgement to the people who were here before us. Um, yeah, and we always have our advisor for the conference is Native American. He's been our advisor since it started. So I think it was important for us to recognize the Native American community as well for that.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely. It's really important, and under that we're going on to our speakers and our panelists, and I think having the picture and the bio is really important for folks, so that they kind of know who's going to be at this conference if they don't know already. I mean, it looks like you have some really famous people here. How does the process go for getting a headshot and bios, and why is it important to have those things in your opinion?
um, Getting a headshot is something that we ask all of our speakers pretty early on, um, because we want it to be in the program, and this past year it needs to be online. I think it's important for people to see diversity and that it was intentional.
Mhm.
Um, we don't. It's not a mistake that we have a keynote speaker is African American woman. Like we wanted her to be there. Um, I think that's why it's important for people to see what these people look like, that they look like them. Especially for pre-med students, I would have really liked to see medical students who look like me and doctors who look like me. So I think that aspect is important. Plus, also for networking opportunities. You run across a student in the hall. You're like, hey, I saw you speak at that conference. And I asked you about what you talked about. So,
Yeah, it's definitely helpful when you're trying to find people at a conference if you want to ask them questions, and
mhm,
um,
yeah,
that's really
for
cool.
networking.
Sorry, go ahead, Roberta.
No, I just said for networking. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a really comprehensive site. You have a list of workshops. You have the agenda, which is so helpful for people, and recordings as well for virtual conferences. I know this is a premium, right? For folks that can't make it because of their schedules. This is really nice to have. Let's talk a little bit about social media now, something I alluded to before. You all have a YouTube, a Facebook, a Twitter, an Instagram. Does one person run all of that?
So we have a media co-chair. Um, so for the past 2 years, there's been three chairs. One person does community outreach. That was my role. One person does logistics, and the other person does media. So that person, the chair that heads media, actually heads a committee of people, um, medical students and other health professional students at Upstate, who all work together to do the social media things for the conference. And we've gotten really lucky that our media team really knows what they're doing and they're on point.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
That's that's amazing. I mean, especially with social media, I feel like it can be a really tricky space as well. It's amazing because folks have access to it. You don't have to pay to have a Facebook, though you have to pay to have the technology and the equipment and the Wi-Fi, right? So it's not completely accessible to everybody. But that being said, it can be a landmine as well. Folks on Twitter or Facebook posting comments that may or may not be the best. Have you all dealt with any harmful comments in YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or has it gone pretty well for you all? And if you've gotten harmful comments, how have you dealt with it together?
Yeah, I have not heard of any harmful comments.
Good.
So, yeah.
That's good. I know, in times where PNHP has dealt with anything like that, it can be really rough. But knowing that, you can ask Facebook or Twitter to delete something, or you can block people, that's a helpful tool for anybody running a conference if they ever run into something like that. I know I've been on Zoom meetings where I've had to kick people out. So just a tip to our viewers here: if you ever deal with something like that, you don't have to be polite. You can kick people out. So just a tip from me, from me to you. And I love this about page on the YouTube where you have all the links. I think that's really helpful for folks and if they're looking to find more information. But I think a lot of us are really married to our emails the most. I don't always go to Facebook or Instagram for updates, but I definitely go to my email. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here. And I'd love to talk to you about communication with your conference attendees. How often are you doing that? And what do you think are helpful tips for folks wanting to communicate with folks?
Communicating with attendees.
Yeah.
So that is something that we also had some disagreements about as chairs, but I think overall we try to strike a balance between making sure they were informed and not filling up their mailbox too often if they were important announcements. So I think so. First, there's two really, like, there's before the conference emails and then after the conference emails. So before conference emails, remember to register. When they were in person, I think we had people register for what workshops they were going to make sure that we could see how many people were going to each workshop, so we had enough chairs for each room.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to see what kind of dietary preferences people had. Yeah, just staying up to date on the current alerts or information that we had for the conference. After the conference, we would send out emails to get their response and their feedback, and then follow-up information that we wanted to give everyone and how to stay involved in the community. I think those were the main things that we sent out. Yeah. But yeah, kind of strike a balance between not sending too many emails, but also keeping everyone informed.
Yeah, that's a struggle, right? Like, how do you not inundate people with so much communication, but make sure that they know things? Is that more, do you follow a number for that? Like, okay, once we pass 3 emails for this conference, like we're starting to annoy people, or do you go by feel just based on kind of how you would respond yourself?
I think we went on feel.
Yeah.
There are definitely more emails right before the conference. Like in the week leading up to the conference, there are more emails than in the previous months. And then you don't want to go too long after the conference, just send a follow-up email. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Those are the main things. And then the last thing that we really need to tell our viewers about is the day of, and that craziness, or the couple days of. What are things running through your mind the day of that you're making sure are set up? And how are you allocating roles to people to make sure that it's not all on you?
Yeah. So we try as hard as possible to make sure that we think of anything that can go wrong. We're trying to make a plan to prevent that from happening. Um, and it was different for this past year's virtual conference versus the day of. I think the day of things that we saw going wrong was, I think the first thing we thought of was potentially not having enough food. So we had someone on back order to bring in, we had a backup plan to bring in extra food just in case a huge amount of people show up who weren't registered. We could easily bring food. Um, we had volunteers, student volunteers, who manned different posts. So making sure that everyone knew what they were doing, were at their post on time, making sure that all the speakers were there and were able to find their way there, making sure that attendees could find their way there. Yeah, it's definitely, day of things are definitely not something that just 3 people can do. It definitely takes a team of people to make sure that the day goes smoothly.
Yeah. And how do you make sure you get a break during the day? Something that's always funny to me is making sure that your volunteers have time to like use the bathroom.
Mhm.
You forget. How do you make sure you yourself and your volunteers have time to like step away and be people as well?
Yeah. I think when I chaired the past year, not this year, but the past year, one of the past years told me, I think during the day, maybe early in the day, like, remember to listen and enjoy the day. And I really took that to heart because I was like, so long to get to speaker lineup and have diverse topics that are interesting. Like, I want to make sure that I hear what they're talking about and not be so, because it's very easy to be overwhelmed in my head, like, oh, do we have enough chairs for this room? And do we have enough food? How's the coat check? And so many things going on that you forget to listen to the speaker and what they're talking about. Because it's also a day, we're passionate about the event. That's why we put it on. So I also want to make sure that I get my fill of learning for the day as well. Um, yeah, I think that was. I can't say there's too much. I'm not gonna lie and say that I was breaking a lot. The day was really busy for me. I was running around each workshop. I tried to see as many workshops as I can during the time. Um, yeah, but I think that that was my little break. When I was in a workshop, I would sit down, make sure that I cleared my head of all the other noise and things that I was thinking about and just pay attention and listen to the speaker.
Yeah, that's so important. I think that's really good advice for folks to remember to enjoy what you worked so hard to set up.
Mhm.
And I think that's a great segue into our last segment here, which is mistakes. What are some mistakes that folks can avoid off the bat by remembering, key tenets of putting on a good conference? What are the biggest mistakes that one can make?
Mm, mhm. I- Something that a mistake that the conference has made in the past has, the one I can think of most prominently was probably in choosing a keynote speaker.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, as I said, it's really hard to find a good keynote speaker, but you really do want to spend extra time doing your background research to make sure that they're a good, engaging speaker and not just someone who's good on paper and has a great resume. Because you ask the keynote speaker for an hour, that's a really long time, and you can lose people if that person's not engaging and not speaking on an interesting topic. Um, so I think that is somewhere that you can make a combo. And then speakers in general, you do want to vet your speakers to make sure that they stay on a time limit. Like, you don't want someone doing a workshop. The times have changed, varied between like an hour to 45 minutes. 45-minute workshop. You don't want a speaker coming in with a 200 slide PowerPoint because they're not going to get through all the slides, and it's going to be frustrating for the speaker. It's going to be frustrating for you. It's going to be frustrating for the the people in the workshop. So if you can ask your speakers to give you their PowerPoints ahead of time, that is always pretty tricky. But and sometimes we preface it by saying we don't need a final draft. We just want to see what you're planning on speaking about, so we can advertise correctly. And so yeah, I think speakers are probably where issues come up. Um, food, yeah. Fortunately, we didn't have we we were running a little bit short on food, but we were able to make it and make it stretch. That's what I remembered. Um, but yeah, having a backup plan to have enough food. I think that's it. I think in terms of the logistics of the day, I was involved from the conference the first time it's ran, and I was in the logistics of the day and like making sure everyone finds the conference and making sure there's enough chairs in the room, and those kinds of things always tend to work out better than you expect it to.
Right.
Yeah, there's generally not a problem with the attendees of the conference. They're usually all very kind and respectful. Um, There was no Zoom bombing at our conference this past year.
Good.
Um, yeah, it's really nice. I think the only thing that this may be a Zoom conference. I don't know how many more Zoom conferences this era that we're going through. Zoom conferences will continue to be a thing, but something to that we took note of was that people really wanted um, interaction with other participants. I think that was what was lacking. The the virtual conference this year was great, but you did miss the opportunity to get to network with people um, and meet other people who are attending the conference and just chat to the speakers afterwards about what they are doing. Personal connections were missing. So trying to do that somehow through virtual conference, I think something to note. Mm, yeah, I think that's it. Those are my biggest errors. Yeah.
I mean, I love that advice, and I think it's really comprehensive. And I'm not sure how many more Zoom conferences we're going to have. I mean, we're obviously recording for one right now, but hopefully we can all be together again soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I want to ask you is, where can people find you on social media? If you want people to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle? If you prefer to live in obscurity,
Off the grid.
off the grid.
I think my Twitter name is just Robertha Barnes. I think
Okay.
yeah. I think you should be able to find me. Robertha Barnes. I think I just have a Twitter right now. I like being connected with other med students on Twitter and like the Campaign for New York Health and Medicare for All movement, but I don't have to see all the little details in everyone's life that you can get caught up in on Facebook. So
Yes.
that's why I only have a Twitter right now.
Twitter can be the best thing and the worst thing,
Yeah, that's
depending on
true.
the day.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for imparting your knowledge on us, Robertha. I want the
Mhm.
audience to know that you organized this conference on top of being a medical student, on top of being a SNAP board member. Um, you really did it all, and it amazes me. Um, and that's not an expectation that we should put on you to do it all. I think you're an excellent organizer, you're an excellent speaker, you're an excellent student. And we're so grateful that you chose to do all three at the same time. So thank you for everything you do for us, Robertha.
Okay, no problem.